This had happened to me about 6 years ago. I was doing my usual routine of walking around town for a few hours, as I enjoyed walking, and I was getting my steps in for the day. I'd always start from my house, walk around town for a few hours, then turn around and head back home. I'd always go walking around noon, or an hour or two later, at the latest. My walks would start at 11 a.m. at the earliest, or 2 p.m. at the latest. This day in particular, I had a bunch of things to do, so I was unable to go out walking before noon. I'd eventually finished up everything that I needed to do, but it was already in the mid to late afternoon. I checked the time, and it was almost 3 p.m. I debated whether or not if I should go walking or if I should go tomorrow instead, since I had nothing going on the next day. I said fuck it and decided to go for my walk, but I told myself that I had to cut it short since I didn't want to be out after sunset, since it would get pretty cold at night. I got dressed and headed out to get my walk in for the day. Fast forward almost 3 hours later, I looked at my phone to check the time, saw that it was almost 6 p.m., and started to make my way back home. I had a bit of a problem, which was I was about 6 miles away from my house, and it would take me about an hour and a half or more to get there. The sun had fully gone down, and there was only a faint orange glow in the sky from it. The night sky had begun to take over, and the air was turning cold. I began to make my way home, and had picked up the pace as I didn't want to be outside when it was cold. I was about 2 miles away from my home and thought I was in the clear when I was wrong. I passed by a convenience store when I noticed a man sitting on the side of the building smoking a cigarette. The man looked to be in his early to mid-30s, wore a black hoodie, black pants, and black shoes. I saw him turn his head towards me, and he gave me a blank stare. I thought nothing of it, and just ignored it. I turned around a few moments later and saw he had gotten up from his spot and began walking the same direction I was going. I kept checking behind me often to see if he would turn down another street, but he never did. After several minutes of him walking the same way as me, I hear the man start yelling, "Hey." He then started saying other stuff to try to get my attention, which I ignored. Right after that, I heard him yell, "What the fuck?" at me in an angry tone. I sped up and didn't dare to look back at that point. I texted my dad and explained that there's some creepy guy following me and how he was yelling at me. My dad replies, asking me how far I am, and I say about less than a mile away. He replies back that to keep walking, don't worry, and that he'll come and get me in the next few minutes. I turned behind me to see if he's still following, as he stopped yelling, and he was, unfortunately. I was 3/4 of a mile away from my house, and I thought about just running there. At the same time, I didn't want this guy to follow me and find out where I lived. I was about to turn down the street I lived at when something told me not to. I texted my dad and told him I passed the street and to go the other way, which he replied with, "Okay." I kept going forward, passing the street, when all of a sudden, I heard some kind of frantic noise. I turned around only to see to my horror that the guy put his hood up and was sprinting straight towards me. Without hesitation, I bolted straight ahead and ran across the street. I kept running for what felt like hours until I saw a pair of headlights coming down the street. I waved my arms like a madman, hoping they would see me. Thankfully they did, and the car stopped. I got closer and saw it was my dad. I looked behind me only to see that the man who was chasing me had somehow disappeared. I got in the car and explained everything to him. He said that he was going to drive down the street to see if he could find the man and would confront him. We drove down the street only to see nobody walking on the sidewalk or hiding behind the bushes. There was no sign of anyone being out, as the streets were empty. From that day on, I never go out walking after 2 p.m., and I since then carry a pocket knife with me whenever I go out walking, for my own safety and protection. I don't know what that man would have done to me had he caught me, and I don't think I ever want to know. This happened to me when I was in middle school. For context, we used to live in an old, decrepit house in a rundown neighborhood, the kind of place where the paint peeled off the walls and the streets always felt eerily empty. Our house was surrounded by 2 types of fences, a tall, weathered wooden fence in the far back, and a white picket fence around the front and sides. It all seemed harmless enough at first. The first year we lived there, the neighborhood was unnervingly quiet. We rarely saw the neighbors, and even the usual sounds of a community, the hum of chatter, the bark of a dog, were absent. It wasn't until the second year that things began to change, and not for the better. It started with a knock at my bedroom window. At first it was soft, almost dismissible, as if a branch had brushed against the glass. But it happened again, and again. Every time I told my parents about it, but they didn't believe me. They waved it off as an overactive imagination. I was spiritual back then, and thought maybe the house was haunted. After all, it creaked incessantly, and strange noises seemed to echo from the walls. The knocking felt like another layer to the house's dark presence. Weeks passed, and the knocking escalated. It grew louder, sharper, more insistent. My room had 2 windows, one above my nightstand and another by my bed. The sound always came from the window above my nightstand, never the one by my bed, which had a strange, loud metal box with fans humming beneath it. Outside the nightstand window were bushes, nothing that should have been capable of making such precise, deliberate noises. As the knocking grew more intense, I confided in my younger sister. To my horror, she admitted she'd heard similar sounds at her window. Together, we told our parents, hoping they'd take us seriously now, but their response was the same. My dad claimed he investigated and found nothing. Then came the night I'll never forget. It was late summer, the kind of sticky, sleepless night where you do anything to pass the time. I had built a small pillow fort in my room, draped with sheets, and was watching the Dolan twins on YouTube to distract myself. When I finally decided to put my phone away and try to sleep, the tapping started. At first it was faint, almost hesitant. I froze, my heart pounding. The tapping grew louder, turning into harsh, rhythmic knocks. Then came the pounding. Each strike against the glass rattled the window, making it feel as though it might shatter. I was paralyzed with fear, tears streaming down my face as I lay motionless. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The house fell silent after that, but not for long. The knocking subsided in the weeks that followed, only for stranger things to happen. I remember staring out my window one afternoon and noticing the bushes below it. They had been trampled, twisted unnaturally. That's when it hit me. This wasn't the work of some ghost. Someone had been out there. Other events confirmed my suspicions. One night my family returned home late. As we approached the house, I heard a phone ping from the bushes under my sister's window. It was the unmistakable chime of a notification, and yet when we looked, there was no one there. It happened again a few nights later, this time under my own window while I lay in bed. We also began finding strange objects outside the house. Rocks and marbles would appear out of nowhere, scattered in front of the garage. These weren't rocks from the area. They looked like they'd come straight from a playground. I started to suspect our reclusive neighbor. He was the only person we ever saw in the neighborhood, and even that was rare. Whenever I caught a glimpse of him, he'd retreat out of sight, vanishing behind the tall wooden fence. One evening, while sitting on the back porch swing with my sister, we saw him. He was standing at the edge of our yard, peering over the fence at us. His gaze was unrelenting, cold. Then without a word, he began pacing along the fence, back and forth, watching us. Our mother, noticing him through the window, rushed us inside. She stayed by the glass back door, keeping an eye on him as he continued pacing, his eerie silence unbroken. It wasn't until my grandfather arrived that the man finally retreated to his house. After that, things quieted down, mostly. The occasional knocks and strange objects persisted, but the worst seemed to be over. Years later, after we moved, my fears were confirmed. The family that moved in after us, a couple with 2 sons, experienced similar disturbances. One night, their eldest son had accidentally thrown something away and went outside to retrieve it from the trash. The next morning, they found a letter on their porch. It wasn't in the mailbox. The letter read, "I saw your son last night digging through the trash. You should tell him to be more careful. You don't know who is watching." The family didn't stay long after that. Even now, the thought of that house haunts me. To this day, no one knows who was behind the knocks, the rocks, the letters. All I know is that the fear I felt was real. The kind of fear that lingers long after you've left it behind.